First of all, thanks to all of you for your diligence in persevering and finding a way to Houston in the face of the coronavirus nightmare that we're all experiencing, including the economic realities that we watched in the stock market over the last couple of days. The interesting notion here, of course, is that we get system shocks from a variety of different sources to our port complexes around the world. And this one is out of the ordinary in the sense that it came from the health sector, but nonetheless, yet another major shock to the system that we're all going to have to find a way to live through. What I thought I would try to do for you this morning is provide sort of an analogy first to an experience that I lived through back in the immediate wake of 9/11, standing up TSA and standing up the Department of Homeland Security. Then I'll offer a premise on the value of strategic planning generally, because what we're really doing at the conference is a part of the thinking pattern that is about strategically planning for the well-being of our economic network and be playing out in our ports around the country. I'll tell a couple stories which I think will bring those thoughts into focus for you, and then offer you a framework for this strategic planning notion as it relates to our ports and the ports of the future. So first, the analogy. The analogy I wanted to use was the sort of 5 magic words that we all came to use as we stood up the new Department of Homeland Security after 9/11. First and foremost, the legislation, the Homeland Security Act of 2002, was perhaps not the clearest piece of legislation ever crafted by our Congress, mainly because everybody seemed in the wake of 9/11 to need to have their paragraph in the law. And so it became a bit of a patchwork quilt, which really was a quite confusing document to those of us who were under the leadership of Governor Tom Ridge to stand up this new cabinet level agency. So we literally went to an offsite, not unlike what you guys are all doing this morning, and sat around for a couple of days trying to sort out what was the real job description of this new Department of Homeland Security, and came up with these 5 magic words. And the words were awareness, prevention, protection, then the notion of a God forbid event, followed by the last 2 words, recovery and response. I'm sorry, in the opposite order, response and then recovery. So the 5 words again were awareness, prevention, protection, response, and recovery. And we had gathered about 60 people of all of these elements of the federal establishment that were being relocated to become the new Department of Homeland Security. And we challenged everybody in the room to be able to see their work in one or more of those 5 words, or we sort of weren't going to leave the room until we had that established. That became the structure of the job description and the work to be undertaken by the new Department of Homeland Security. So let me give you the magic words again: APPRR, awareness, prevention, protection, response, and recovery. And today, outside the Secretary's office, these many years later, there's a bronze plaque that sort of establishes those 5 words as the continuing and lasting elements of the major work categories, the buckets of work, if you will, of what the Department of Homeland Security does. Now, let me shift for a moment to the premise of what I'm trying to get across today, that is the value of strategic planning. I simply have long believed and invested in everywhere that I've worked as Commandant of the Coast Guard, or as the brand new administrator at TSA, or the brand new Deputy Secretary at DHS, the value of a methodical, systematic planning paradigm that everyone could count on and literally see their work in. And so I took this idea when I was at school at the National War College back in 1985, when the president of the university there was a prior Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Or I'm sorry, he was the strategic planning officer for the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. And he used this example, which has stuck with me literally ever since, for now it's about 35 years. And he said his responsibility was to go see the Chief of Staff of the Air Force once a month. And he was to bring 2 or 3 sort of wild and crazy ideas, if you will, to the Chief of Staff, explain why they were thinking what they were thinking, and then watch the reaction from the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. Most of the time, he said, my ideas went right into that round file beside the Chief of Staff's desk. But every once in a while, he perked up and was all of a sudden very intent on what he had just heard. And the one that he used as an example was the time that he, of his strategic planning responsibilities, was making his monthly presentation to the Chief of Staff, and said, one of the things we're thinking about is what would we like if we could develop something that enabled planes that could not be seen on radar. Think of that for just a second. Planes that could not be seen on radar. Chief of Staff picked up on that idea, assigned a lot of other very bright people in the R&D world of the United States Air Force. And what came out of that, of course, was stealth technology that we now see in the B-1s, the B-2s, the major fighters, the F-35, all those aircraft are now coated with stealth technology to the point where it's very difficult for them to be seen on radar. An enormous tactical advantage when those people are doing what they need to do in the service of the Air Force, in the service of our country. So if you shift a notion toward our world of work, and also take the notion that strategic planning ideas are great, they sound really good, but it's only when they only become important if and when they produce tactical results. So the tactical results in the Air Force for that idea was the stealth technology that has become so extraordinarily important in research and manufacturing of aircraft today. On the port side of the coin, one of the stories I also like to tell is the investment that the Coast Guard and the maritime community has made forever with regard to collaborative efforts in the business of the maritime domain of our global marketplace. And of course, on 9/11 in New York Harbor, the often unappreciated and untold story is the extraordinary effort that was undertaken by the maritime community, the Port of New York and New Jersey, all the tugboats, the Staten Island Ferry, the tour boat around the Statue of Liberty, who responded to a call on Channel 16, the emergency frequency in the maritime domain, of several Coast Guard officers who had recognized one of the challenges that was going on Manhattan after the nightmare, or in the middle of the nightmare. All of us watching on TV saw people walking north, running north over the Brooklyn Bridge to the north from the tragic site at the World Trade Center. What people did not appreciate and often were not aware of was that there were almost as many people going south into the Battery and literally jumping into New York Harbor to get away from the nightmare of the crumbling World Trade Center towers. Almost 500,000 people were then taken off of Manhattan to the south over the water to Staten Island or to New Jersey by an armada of available boats that were called to action by several Coast Guard officers and became arguably the most significant boat lift in history, and certainly measures up against what we recall from movies and reading about the French and English forces taken off of Dunkirk in World War II. 500,000 people were taken off Manhattan that day. About 300,000, I think, is the number that I recall from the Dunkirk evacuation. So why do I tell you that story? Well, the notion is about the value of the investment into strategic planning and its thinking, so that when the tactical results are mandatory, in other words, when the crisis is at hand, you can take advantage of the investment that you've made. And in the face of what happened in New York, the collaborative maritime community working with each other to take a nightmare and turn it into a pretty amazing result. So how does any of this relate to the ports of the future, which is what you're all gathered to talk about? Well, I offer to you that the notion of awareness, protection, awareness, prevention, protection, response, and recovery is not necessarily the paradigm that we might want to use when we're thinking about the ports of the future in our country, whether they are airports, seaports, or land borders, points of entry across our land borders. And so I'm offering the following, and you might want to write this down if you have a pencil at hand, for whatever value it might be for your thinking across the balance of your time in Houston, let alone back home. But I think words like awareness, innovation, workforce, and operations, where the two principal subs from operations would be distribution and supply chain, those kind of words, if thought about strategically and planned for such that the tactical realities become what you want them to become over time, is the kind of a framework that would offer those of us who live and work in the maritime domain especially, but just as applicable to the airports of our country and to the land ports of entry, the kind of things that make an awful lot of sense. So let me capture some ideas under each of those titles. Under the notion of awareness, the idea is to conceptually stay as aware as you can possibly be of all the activities that are going on that backdrop what you have to do on a daily, at your daily workplace. And so I'm talking about liaison activities with federal government, with state government, with local government, and certainly in the case of our airports and our seaports and our international domain, together with IMO for those who go to sea and ICAO for those who make their living in the air, the whole notion of what's happening there, what kind of regulatory activity are they thinking about, what's going to be brought to bear on my workplace by what's happening in an awareness notion. So it's about good communications, it's about intelligence, it's about the Smart Ports initiative for the future, where we stay very much aware of the impactful activities and ideas that are being circulated about our world of work, and that we sustain those carefully over time and press ourselves to find the best way to do what we do in the face of those kind of ideas. With regard to innovation, this is about cybersecurity as an overlay to all the work that we did with regard to people security and physical security in the immediate wake of 9/11. The National Response Framework is the sort of governing document these days, and we're finding that the cybersecurity challenges that are front page news for all of us is now like an overlay on top of all the work that we did with regard to physical security and people security back in the immediate wake of 9/11. Other ideas that would find their way inside this innovation notion: artificial intelligence, even emotional intelligence, a new gathering concept actually being pressed out of a book that was produced by a set of PhDs at Yale that is all of a sudden trying to help us understand through this initiative of emotional intelligence how we actually react to what it is that we see as pressure points and inputs. Automation, robotics, the equipment that we put on our ships, future power sources such as wind or solar. All of this is an innovation set of pressures taking place in our world of work. Shifting to the word distribution, one of the other words in my nominated framework. The distribution of what happens in our ports, whether it's about rail or trucking or long haul or local, access control to those ports, warehousing within those ports or elsewhere, hubs of distribution, for example, inland terminals that we have to facilitate the means of getting the 95% of what comes to this country that comes by sea onto a distribution network that gets that shirt that was made in China to the Kmart in Kansas City, that any of our citizens will have the opportunity to purchase it. So distribution is an enormously important part of what we do for a living. The supply chain that you all are so sensitive to, aware of, and are part of, whether it's about capacity or resiliency or efficiency or nimble data streams, all those kind of things find their way inside their standard and are equally important to what we do for a living. The workforce of the future. Are we satisfied that we have in place the ability to recruit, the ability to train, and the ability to put into play, to vet them properly, to train them properly, to establish career patterns for them, to optimize the work that goes on in our ports these days? Again, I say whether they're airports, seaports, or land ports of entry, that whole notion of making certain that when the future arrives, whether that's 5 years from now, 10 years from now, or whatever, we have generated the workforce necessary to do what's going to need to be done in those particular ports of the future. And lastly, the word operations, which is all about the routine that we normally see today. As part of my thinking to talk with you this morning, I chatted with my good friend John Reinhardt in Norfolk and Thimble Shoals here in Virginia. I chatted with Beth Ann Rooney up in the Port of New York and New Jersey, and with my old colleague Rick Larrabee, who many of you know from his days as the ops director in the Port of New York and New Jersey after his wonderfully successful Coast Guard career. I chatted with those guys just with the notion of picking their brain a little bit. Beth Ann Rooney and John Reinhardt both were very kind to share with me the executive summaries of their master plans, which is all about their thinking and their respective ports of responsibility as to where those two ports have to be cognizant of what's happening of the moment. So it is about what they're doing about greenhouse gases, because that kind of thing gets regulated by IMO. It's all about dredging projects. It's all about the efficiency of the existing port structures that they're responsible for today. It's all about the management of the safety system attendant to those activities, and then watching the supply and demand curve of their services go up, almost always up, as we look towards the complicated future and the population trends that we see only increasing on this planet, that will demand enormously more collaborative intermodal connections in the hubs of our operational ports and port systems that we work with today. And then lastly, some things like environmental impacts, which sort of are about noise and congestion and greenhouse gases, as I mentioned a moment ago. All of those things are inside the master plans of the major ports of our country as they step toward the future. And it just seemed very important to me to share with you that inside this notion of a framework that I offered, there would be those kind of considerations that are part and parcel of the daily work and daily chores of our ports, not only today, but those in the future as well. So let me close with at least a notion about where this conference can help you think your way through any of that that I just sort of rolled on the table. First and foremost, if you look at awareness There are panels attendant to emerging trends and threat intelligence, both air, land, and sea. The cargo aviation and insider threat assessment panels and speakers are another opportunity to learn about awareness. Non-intrusive inspection technologies, which you had the opportunity to sit in on, listen to those exchanges, and upgrade your personal awareness about the ports of the future and the challenges that they will face. When it comes to innovation, Brian Harrell's keynote was all about cyber. There are plenary addresses from Rear Admiral Mike Ryan, a luncheon keynote by Alan Burson, an old commissioner of CBP, and a panel on unmanned surveillance systems, all of which are focused on innovation as the speakers, will share with you their ideas, their thoughts about what's going on to keep you abreast of those innovative ideas and challenge you to be thoughtful about them when you get back home to your respective workplace. As it relates to distribution, there are opportunities at the conference for you to think your way through blockchain technology, intermodal connectivity, freight mobility, freight shuttle systems, illicit financial flows. All of those things have impact on the distribution system that is part and parcel of your ability to make your port an efficient place and an effective place in the economic domain of the world. When you think about the supply chain, there are opportunities for you to listen to modeling and simulation activities. Again, the illicit financial flows, I think, plays into that as well. Cybersecurity certainly plays into the supply chain. Product introduction like LNG, and how are we going to eventually incorporate that in not only LNG ports but elsewhere. And important port improvement projects, port infrastructure challenges. All of those topics are on the menu for you at the conference, and I would encourage you, where your interests lie, to take advantage of them as part and parcel of your learning process at the conference. On the workforce end, there are discussions on the menu for you about community relations, about marketing, about communication skills, about workforce development panels, both seaports and land ports of entry. And then there are institute representatives, university representatives, even peers of yours at various ports that offer you a chance to have conversations even at the coffee pot, as opposed to a formal panel or speaking presentation, and learn from each other with regard to what it is that the workforce of the future port complexes will be challenged to be able to do, and how do we make certain that the pathway is in place for them to gain those skills and be as efficient and effective in their jobs 10 years from now as all of your people are at the workplace today. Lastly, with regard to operations generally, there's a panel on port resilience and port infrastructure. I would certainly encourage anyone to listen in on that, because the immediate inbox that you're all going to go back to, as you well know, is the same inbox that you left to come to Houston. And so the challenges that are there for today's port activity package are very much waiting for you to get home and solve. But one of the notions that I used several times in my career, both at the Coast Guard and at TSA and in the new department, was recognizing the value of tabletop exercises to prepare you for what you know is coming down the road, and you're not real sure whether your current organizational structure, workforce, is going to be able to handle it. If you put it on a tabletop exercise and walk yourself through it and bring the experts that are planning that future to the table with you, you can learn an enormous amount and reshape or adjust the activity set that you have in mind on the way to that future to be better prepared when it actually occurs. So there are port improvement project breakout sessions. There is a session on deploying Lean Six Sigma, which we've all touched the base with, probably on many occasions in the past. Again, the modeling and simulations offer an opportunity for you to learn about the value of such things and then put them in practice back home. And marine environment protection is obviously a topic that I see on your menu that is of concern to all of us. And it is all of you who will take that back and make it work in your own workplace. So let me close with just a couple of reinforcements. First of all, to reinforce again the extraordinary notion that greater than 90%, 92, 93% of the global trade on this planet, let alone that 92 or 93% that comes and goes to the United States and from the United States, moves by ship. The extraordinary economic impact that represents now being challenged to a degree in terms of the coronavirus, as we watch different decisions being made by port directors around the country, and even by airlines who are not flying to port A or port B of the moment because of the virus. The extraordinary economic impact probably most reflected just by the stock exchange over the last week, where just yesterday we had the most significant 7.8, I think it was, % drop in the value of the exchange. The impact of a unexpected and external force is always very, very real. And when you're in the business of moving 90% of the global trade for a living, the impact on you at work is going to be enormously significant as well. The expanse of the system these days is almost beyond the layman's belief. You know, whether it's airports, seaports, land ports of entry, tunnels, terminals, railroads, highways, byways, warehouses, container ships and tankers, the assets that are used, and the system itself is so expansive that the scope demands that we have conferences like you're attending to exchange the very best ideas and become a collaborative group with regard to the well-being of protecting that global trade in the future. Third point I'd make is to think about the value of a systematic capture like I offered you. And the magic letters, I think, were AIDSWO: awareness, innovation, distribution, supply chain, workforce, and operations. AIDSWO. The idea of being able to capture notions in categories like that and reduce them to things that we can actually impact and do something about offers us a challenge for each of us to understand better, and offers us specific elements by which we can optimize our work and therefore produce the best impact for the future of our port, which we're working at, and our country, which it's part of. So lastly, take advantage of what the conference offers. Look carefully at the menu of panels and speakers so that you can be a smarter contributor when you go back home. I thank you for putting up with this rather strange delivery system where I'm comfortable in my office in my house in Williamsburg, Virginia. I'm not certain as to how we're going to make a Q&A opportunity work, but I would be happy to answer some questions from the audience if the IT experts there can make that happen. So thank you all very much for your attention, and I hope that AIDSWO becomes an acronym from which you can learn more from the conference and be prepared to be a better steward of our global trade system when you get back home. Thank you very much.